Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're at, friends. Welcome to our 30-second webinar session of the Green Roads webinar series entitled Using Multi-Hazard and Criticality Analytics to Strengthen Road Network Resilience. I am Gloria Herilia Tecnomo from the transport sector at ADB, and I am your moderator for today's webinar. As we look at the increasing frequency of climate-related disasters, it has become clear that our transport infrastructure is on the front lines. Damage to a single road link is rarely just a physical repair issue. It is a socio-economic disruption that can sever trade routes and isolate communities. Climate and disaster risk are increasingly disrupting road connectivity across Asia and the Pacific, with estimates that the damage from such events accounts for 65% of the total cost to transport infrastructure damage in the region. This Green Roads webinar will explore how multi-hazard datasets, advanced traffic modeling, and accessibility diagnostics can support resilience-focused investment planning. Drawing on ADB-supported studies in Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, and Tajikistan, this session will demonstrate how network-level analytics can identify exposure hotspots, critical corridors, and priority interventions to strengthen road network resilience under a changing climate. The outputs from these studies can then guide adaptation actions, along with ensuring that projects meet the system assessment criteria for climate financing. Today, we are joined by two leading experts who are bridging the gap between complex data and actionable infrastructure policy. Our first speaker is Associate Professor Elko Cox from the Institute for Environmental Studies at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Elko's work focuses on disaster impact modeling, critical infrastructure, climate adaptation, network analysis, and macroeconomics. He has contributed to major national and European research programs and received a prestigious Veni grant from the Netherlands Scientific Organization. Elko leads several European projects on climate and transformative adaptation of critical infrastructure systems. He also frequently advises international organizations, including the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank, on climate risk assessments for critical infrastructure. Our second speaker is Professor S. Travis Waller, who is the Lighthouse Professor and Chair of Transport Modeling and Simulation at the Technische Universität Dresden in Germany. He's also Managing Director at Mobility Thinking, an Australian firm that focuses on leveraging emerging AI and data technology alongside traditional planning principles for automated transport modeling. Travis previously held professorships at University New South Wales in Sydney, Australian National University, and the University of Texas in Austin. At the University of South Wales, he was head of civil and environmental engineering and deputy dean of engineering research. He also founded the Network Modeling Center and City at UNSW. They will walk us through a multi-tiered framework integrating river flooding, landslides, and seismic hazards and advanced traffic modeling to identify not just where roads are vulnerable, but where they are at most critical to a nation's functioning. Following the presentations here, there will be a Q&A session. Please submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and your microphone will be muted throughout unless you have been invited to speak. Dr. Cox, Professor Waller, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning. I would like to share my screen. Can I replace current share? Oh, there we go. Yeah. So thanks again for this invitation, and I'm very happy that today Travis and myself can share some of the work we've been doing for Michael and Jalla the past almost 2 years now, I think. So yeah, the focus of this presentation is to really think about multi-asset criticality, strengthening road network resilience, where we showcase the work we've been done across the 3 countries, and also across the countries there has been development over time. And given the length of the presentation, we're just going to take examples from the different countries, sort of a bit mixed throughout the presentation, but most of the analysis has been performed for all of them. So a bit of a rationale behind the study. Why did we decide to focus on this? Well, I think the first one is obvious. We, of course, I think are all aware that transport infrastructure is highly vulnerable to climate hazards, indirect damages, service disruptions, and given its important societal function, broader economic and social losses are mostly always occurring when transport infrastructure fails. But we also know that the climate, so we do want to do something about it, but we also know that there's not a never-ending pot of money for adaptation and rehabilitation. So for climate adaptation finance, we really need to know where to prioritize, where to focus on. And to really know where to focus on, we have developed now this sort of national scale criticality and risk analysis to really help to identify hotspots, to provide this first scoping study, which would then guide like deeper local service, detailed engineering assessments, and field investigation. The work we are showing here is by no means a replacement for local surveys, but it rather is a starting point to help to identify where across a large country or across a large network, what are really the key elements in that system that are not only vulnerable to climate change potentially from an asset perspective and exposed, but also have an important function in the functioning of the system. And if that fails, what are then the complicated impacts? So this workflow is what we want to show here. So I'll start first and then Travis will take over, probably somewhere along the middle. It would have made more sense if Travis would then explain the methodology, but it's 7 to 8 a.m. in the morning in the Netherlands, and it's kids' rush hour. So at 7:30 roughly, when I'm done, I'll move downstairs and I'll be ready for the Q&A, but there might be a child next to me in the final bits of this presentation. But let's get started now first with the content. So I think one of the key elements here, I slightly addressed it already, is a little bit, so traditionally when we perform a risk assessment, and that's not infrastructure specific, that's basically for the built environment in general, we follow our traditional risk framework. We have hazard information, be it floods, be it landslides, be it earthquakes, extreme rainfall, river flooding, coastal flooding, or anything that causes a potential impact. We have the exposure information, in our case, the road network itself and all its characteristics, which we then combine through vulnerability curves. And vulnerability curves relate the intensity of the hazard with the potential impact it causes. Either vulnerability curve that shows sort of the relative impact directly on the asset, or the fragility functions that often show the probability of a failure state. Both can be used, albeit often in different contexts, and those combined will help you to identify the risk. But in particular with infrastructure systems, where each asset has also a clear function in the system, we need to add an extra element, and this extra element is criticality, and that's also the focus of what we are presenting here. So we believe that for proper investment in infrastructure, you really need to take this system-level approach where you put criticality right next to vulnerability. And I think in this context, you can even rebrand criticality to network or system vulnerability, where in this case, the traditional vulnerability can be seen as asset vulnerability. So this really helps us to then prioritize what are the key links in the system. And as I also point out in my final bullet, this trickles all the way into adaptation, because if we really look at the different elements in the system in this more multi-tiered way, we can also think about adaptation across those different levels. So what do I mean with multi-tiered? Well, basically, this framework you can sort of rebrand into a more top to bottom trickle down framework. So you have your hazard information that you start with, you overlay it with your assets, which says something about, which then can feed into your vulnerability and asset level risk assessment. An asset as a function in the system. So that asset being unavailable due to some event causes a disruption. This is part of your criticality analysis, and this feeds into your risk assessment. And you can, of course, think about adaptation options across all those different layers, from traditional options that nature-based solutions that feed more on reducing the hazard, to improving drainage capacity of your assets, to think about more operational measures on your network, think about forecasting measures or proper rerouting plans that would then reduce the impact on the criticality, which in the end can all reduce your risk. So this multi-tiered system allows us to also compare adaptation across perhaps the more traditional ones that we used to do in the past. But of course, as said, it always all starts with the direct physical climate risks. So what is the type of data that we've used in the study? River and pluvial flooding were provided by JBA, so they produced this global flood map set for the present day situation. Multiple return periods, and this it was nice because we could consistently use then the same flood map across the countries, both river flooding and pluvial is extreme rainfall flooding. Landslide susceptibility, that information is often not readily available in all countries, despite, of course, all of us, I think, can acknowledge that landslides are a key risk also to road infrastructure. So we use the data as developed within the coalition of disaster resilient infrastructure that every couple of years develop this GERI report, the Global Infrastructure Resilience Index, or Risk Index, I think it was resilience. So they produced a lot of hazard information also for their previous report. Among others, also the earthquake and rainfall triggered landslide susceptibility. So that is what we've used here. And there are also 2 future scenarios for rainfall triggered landslides available. But this is global data, important to mention. Earthquakes, again, same source with multiple return periods that we're now using in this analysis. But again, it's global data. So just to highlight a little bit, I'm not going to in detail where we see the most flooding, but just to showcase how this data looks like. So we have river flooding, and which shows basically across the country the probability of occurrence of certain flood depths happening within the country. So river flooding, of course, shows mostly flooding in the key river basins and tributaries next to major rivers. Extreme rainfall flooding, that one is already a bit more scattered around. And also this was the same for almost all countries. If you zoom it out, you won't see much. But actually, if you would zoom in, you do see clearly that there are patches of flood happening. Basically, well, wherever there's water cannot really freely drain away, either because of the soil type or because it's in some sink. It will stay there, and that can cause flooding. The earthquake maps is then what we've used from CDRI and the GERI report, and same for the landslide. So you can look up all the details of especially the earthquake and the landslides on the website of CDRI as well. So I think that's most useful to just look at that. But because we look at climate adaptation, we also want to get a notion of climate change. So for rainfall-triggered landslides, that information was available. But for river flooding, unfortunately, the flood maps were not, at least when we performed the study, were not available for future situations. And this is a difficulty across the world. For example, in Europe, we also don't have readily available flood maps for the future. So if you don't have flood maps for the future, what you generally use is that instead of having new flood maps, you kind of change the return period, because we know that in the case, for example, for river flooding, in most places where it gets warmer, the extremes become more extreme. So basically a flood event that is currently has a probability of once every 100 years might get a probability of once every 80 years. Of course, it can also get drier, then the probability might go to once every 200 years or once every 150 years. But anyways, your exceedance probability loss curve will change depending on how your extremes might change as well. So, for example, what we did in Pakistan and the study for Pakistan and Papua New Guinea is that there was information available for changes in the maximum river flows across a couple of basins. So we used that to change then our probability exceedance loss curve depending how extreme flows change in the future relative to the baseline. So that worked, and then, or at least that gives us a notion how risk might change. For extreme rainfall, we found some studies, but mostly global, that indicated how the probability of extreme rainfall might change. So that is also what we then use to sort of shift the curves. So again, it's a relatively simple approach, but it's applied quite often when there's a lack of future plot maps available within the study. So the exposure data is basically OpenStreetMap road networks that we used as the baseline from all the high tier roads, motorway trunks, all the way to all the roads, which we've used mostly for our asset level risk assessment and our accessibility loss analysis. So here's Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, and Tajikistan. So for vulnerability, I mentioned them already. So we use our own vulnerability and fragility database that was developed in my group as the baseline. One of my postdocs, Sadhana Niranjansi, developed this global database of curves for multiple infrastructure types and multiple hazards. So we use that as a starting point. And then where possible to national contact points across the studies, we try to validate the choices of the curves. For landslides, because we had susceptibility maps, it was a little bit more tricky to convert that to damages. So to do so, we used again this approach that was presented within the GIRI CDRI study. So there we just base it on what they already did, given that we also used their landslide susceptibility maps. And all of this is modeled, in particularly actually everything, but this is already fully available, all through public tools. So for all the physical asset damage risk assessments, we use our damage scanner that we phrased this, which is directly pip installable by everyone. I just released a major update as well. It's actively maintained, which you can use to simply rerun very quickly any physical asset level risk assessment globally if you have some exposure information and some hazard information. But important here, I think, also to raise the disclaimer. So everything we are presented has, of course, assumptions we had to make around the vulnerability. We often did not know much about the local characteristics of the roads, whether they are on an embankment, what the current state of the road is, which of course is a strong driver of the potential impacts. So I said it before, but I want to state it here again. What we here really show is what are the hotspots across the country, how to relatively compare the roads across the country to identify, okay, these 5 points in the country indeed show up as the most critical and the most at risk in the country. So there we want to further investigate instead of doing a detailed analysis across the entire country. So how do some of these results, for example, look like? So for Tajikistan, which was the first study we did, here on the left-hand side, before I example showed a map of the multi-hazard risk, so where we combine the risk of the different hazard layers to identify what are sort of the places in the road network that experience the highest level of expected annual damages. What we also explored with, but this was really exploratory, also analysis-wise, is what if we use some downscaled climate projections of heat across the country. And of course, this is a very coarse resolution. So I just picked a couple of roads across the country to sort of have a spatial divided pattern across the country, see, okay, how does the number of days exceeding 30 to 35 degrees or 45 to 50 degrees change towards 2100? And we, of course, see we see here in this high-end scenario that a road being exposed to ambient temperatures of 45 to 50 degrees and even above 50 degrees really can become a lot more in the future. And of course, this has a strong impact also on your pavement composition that you might require for your road. For Pakistan, and as you can see, Pakistan probably it also took a bit of time to run because we looked at it of the entire OpenStreetMap network, so all roads. So on the one hand here, we show that there's quite a bit of difference in expected annual damage across the different hazards. And here I just mapped them based on provinces because that was a little bit easier to visualize. But we thought it would be interesting to also still have a look on how many hazards is each road actually exposed. And we see that across the country, there are a few spots where the results show that there was exposure to only 2 hazards, but large swaths of the country are exposed to at least 3 or 4, and some corridors are exposed to even all hazards. So we see that across the country, and of course we know this from past events, many roads are heavily exposed to climate extremes. And then towards the future, using our shift and return period in the curves, the return periods, we can identify how might risk change towards the future. And this uncertainty band around the box plot is also the range of assumptions we took in our analysis. So you see that there, for example, the assumption around the vulnerability curves is a strong driver for the impacts. And we see that landslides and pluvial flooding seem to change a lot less relative to river flooding. PNG, similar study. Interestingly, with PNG is that it's even more roads are exposed to almost all hazards. So you both see this in this map where we just counted the hazards that exposed the road. But also, if you look at the expected annual damages maps, you basically see it all maps, many of the roads clearly lighting up. And again, we know that Papua New Guinea is heavily exposed to natural hazards and climate extremes, but indeed the results do show this here again, even while we use some of this global data. Here we do see that the relative changes towards the future, in particular on fluvial flooding, is a bit less extreme than for Pakistan. The trends for pluvial and landslides remain the same. But then moving on to the more, I guess, novel part of this analysis, and that's more the travel flow and accessibility losses. So Travis, of course, will dive into the details of the world travel flow modeling and how we went about doing that. I really show here some results on how I used this information, which was mainly being performed on the main highway network of each country. So the asset level risk assessment was done on all roads, but here we focus on the main highway, also because the travel flow modeling is a bit more complex. We also perform an accessibility analysis, in particular for healthcare and airports. There, again, I did use the entire network because there we're also much more interested in regional accessibility. And I'm a big fan of hexagons, so we used population per hexagon as a starting point across each country and then try to find the route to the nearest healthcare facility and how that route might change when certain roads are disrupted. So how would this look like? And Travis will show more results in more detail. But for example, for Papua New Guinea, where we have disconnected networks, the north and the south network across the main island are not connected currently. So we modeled them separately, and we saw that there were quite some average increases in travel time, but also quite some roads that will cause a complete isolation of certain communities when being disrupted. And those are because there are many sort of roads that have an end, but no clear alternative redundant path beside them. That's, of course, also partly largely due to the topography of the country. And again, if we do this single point of failure and then see, okay, which of those roads that are important are also exposed to a natural hazard, then we see that in particular to flooding and rainfall triggered landslides, so quite the climate extreme driven hazards. We see that many of the roads also around Port Moresby are potentially, or quite a few roads are potentially exposed and cause large impacts when being disrupted. Pakistan, similar, we create similar results, and there we see that things matter quite a bit depending on the hazard you are. And then, of course, what's interesting then also to do is, okay, so if we have on the one hand this expected annual damage that shows the highest physical damages to each road element, and if we have this travel flow analysis and we do your criticality analysis, where's the overlap? Because, of course, not every road that experiences high asset damages is also important to the larger functioning of the system. So if you combine them both, then you can sort of identify then your key roads that both have high damages and are important for the functioning to help even further prioritize which roads or which corridors you want to look at first. And then moving to accessibility. So for accessibility, we really wanted to mimic flood events that could potentially disrupt then a part of the road network. So what we did, and we've done this in the past, and there are colleagues doing this as well, when there are no flood event sets available and you need event sets to perform this systematic checking of flooding on the system because you need independent events. So return period footprint maps do not work there. So we clip the network into smaller basins, and that is then what we use to sort of remove from the system. So each river basin becomes a unique event, and we remove all the roads at that event that will then disrupt the functioning of the system, and in particular the accessibility to key facilities. So there are different ways on how to look at the results. So one could, of course, look at the relative population affected versus the number of removed edges. So that's just a way of which basins cause the highest impact, either delayed or lost, because there's no alternative. But what we also found interesting is, okay, but what are just in general the total affected population spatially? So that's from a more societal perspective. Which parts of the country experience the highest impact from a people's perspective when certain roads are being disrupted due to flooding? But of course, we can also look at from a roads perspective. So which roads cause the largest delays to reach those critical facilities? So then coming to my final point, sorry, I'm showing a lot of stuff in a short amount of time, but I'm happy to follow up any questions later on. And that's coming back to this adaptation element, which I think that is where it all feeds into. So of course, as I said, we can look at this from a multi-tiered perspective, and each of those levels, you can think of certain measures one want to implement. Unfortunately, and that will be the final slide of presenting, there's not always enough information to do this, and we also experience that again, but this is the ambition. What we were able to do, and so this is what we did as an example, is what if we ensure we maintain our design standards? So what do I mean with maintaining? Well, I already said it at the start. In many places, let's say a 1 in 10 flood event becomes in the future and maybe you have a design standard that is designed for a 1 in 10 flood event of the present day. That means that the design standard will become, and let's say the 1 in 10 flood becomes a 1 in 5 flood. So your design standard of now also becomes a design standard of 1 in 5 then in the future, because it's designed for the characteristics of this 1 in 10 flood. So with maintaining design standards, we say, okay, what if you ensure that you keep on upgrading your drainage, your pavement, everything, to make sure that also in the future you can handle this new 1 in 10 flood. So what are then your avoided losses if you ensure that design standard sort of stays the same? And then of course we can see that those benefits are really high across the country, both for fluvial flooding and for pluvial flooding. But there were a couple of issues with this part of the analysis, and this is the final slide on my side. Good information on cost on measures is quite hard, and actually even harder on this national scale level, Here you really need to also team up with the more local surveys, local investigation to really understand, okay, what does this road really need? What are the drainage characteristics of this road? What is it? Does it lie in an embankment? Like, what are this actually cost of investment? Really depends on the road itself. So good information on this is really still lacking, at least in the public domain. The effectiveness of the measure, and that again links a bit to the first point as well. Good information on the assets themselves. And the third point that we are sometimes still a little bit surprised on, given the large amount of people working on this, improved hazard information for climate change. So we talk a lot about climate change, and of course, many things are being done. We have many global models, regional downscaled models. But what we experience, in particular with these countries, that really very limited information is still there on how, for example, in Papua New Guinea, river flooding might change. We really had, there was one or two studies that we could find, and for Pakistan the same, that did a very good analysis. And for example, from Pakistan, this really came also from researchers from Pakistan. So I think that at least is a very good move forward. But still, the fact that it was really just less than a handful studies really ask us to do a bit more work on this as well, at least prioritize this a little bit as well. So that combined, if we really want to go to this multi-level adaptation comparison, we really need to work still a bit on the data gaps as well. The methods are there, more data. It's a bit of a lame, maybe a bit of a lame end, but really some more data will really help us to further improve our assessments. All right. Thanks for your time. I'll stop here and Travis will take over and also share his screen himself.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elko, as always. Extremely excellent work. Let me see if I can get my screen up there. Hopefully I'm up there now. Let me know if not.
Yes,
but
you are, Travis.
Thank you.
We can.
Perfect. So I'll go deeper into the traffic modeling, and I will be brief as I can. So the goal here is to establish a traffic network modeling that aligns to the workflow that Elko discussed. And there are some challenges. Often building one of these models, especially if starting from scratch, is a rather significant endeavor in and of itself. And so it requires particular approaches to that. But there are certain principles that need to be held if it's fit for purpose, especially when it comes to criticality or evaluation of particular adaptations. There needs to be an appropriate traffic response within that modeling. And so I'll talk around this. I will highlight, and I always want to acknowledge, because the methodologies that I'm talking about are the outcome of quite a few years, even a couple of decades of research across multiple university teams. And I always want to acknowledge all of that work that has gone on over a long point of time that has formed up these methods. But I won't go into detail just given the time on that. And so probably some of the attendees know this as well as I, or better. Years and decades of experience, I'm sure. But critically, there, in terms of that traffic response, the core driving principle is demand and supply equilibration. And that sort of is a hard and fast principle that we would assert cannot be abandoned. That even with machine learning, AI, these emergent techniques around data analytics, and even if it's cell phone data or other forms of emergent data, that we cannot eliminate this concept of demand-supply equilibration, or else the evaluation of the criticality and adaptation would be potentially significantly undermined. That we have to regard that traffic response, and these are very old principles that go back, at least to the 1950s, and in some cases even earlier. And that's, a very common practice, a bit, some would argue a bit dated now, but still state of practice for certain, is the four-step process. And this is represented with how planners often approach this. especially for traffic or multimodal transport systems. And these are established things, and there's reasons why we have them and need to maintain them. I won't go into detail that because of time, but given the time and resource demands of establishing these models, we do want to leverage emerging techniques in building them. So the key principle here is we do not want to replace those principles of transport traffic planning, but we do want to increasingly automate the process of building the model that conforms to those principles. And that's really the goal here, is we're not trying to make, in this instance, there are research streams for that, but in this instance, we're not trying to add some stochasticity or dynamics into these standard traffic models, but rather we're leveraging emerging machine learning techniques, emerging data sources to build these models in a much, much more efficient manner through automation. So we're automating the process. We are not replacing the process with automated analytics. And that's a very key distinction. And that's what allows the models to align to the workflow that Elko outlined. So how can we cut this time to deploy the models? That's the primary thing. But as I noted at the bottom, still allowing for what-if scenarios. And I always acknowledge a good bit of this work recently has been done in collaboration with NVIDIA, who's been a very kind supporter. In terms of in a nutshell, so we also start with OpenStreetMaps, but bringing in rule sets from things like highway capacity manuals and so on to build the traffic supply model, but starting with OSM as a base, but then augmenting through other data sources where available. And then evolutionary algorithms, a branch of machine learning, being used to estimate the travel, origin, destination, demand levels. And I'll go more through that. And this being fed with growing databases of open data like world population data, point of interest data, and others that now inform some aspects of land use. In some cases, satellite nightlight data. That's increasingly interesting information that tends to be globally available. Also terrain data, satellite terrain data we've used very recently in Papua New Guinea, and that growing set. As a flow chart, this is, in a nutshell, the process, that top portion being the establishment of the supply model. So we through automation and these methods, build this transport network, including link performance functions, a zonal structure, and so on to have the supply. And then starting with these type of databases, world population, point of interest, and others, establishing some initial demand estimations that in the first instance will be rough. But then we do an equilibration, a demand-supply equilibration. So network equilibrium remains at the heart of the approach. And equilibrating that demand and supply will produce flows on every link and travel times and so on. And then we compare those modeled metrics versus observed. And the observed can be a broad set as well. One global set we've always been able to acquire are travel times through a growing number of providers, Google, TomTom, Mapbox, many others that derive them often from cell phone data, but it's not trajectories, it's not statistical inferences, it's estimations of link travel time. And those are pretty broadly now available. But then in addition, any local data. So for all of the cases we've looked at, we've always been able to get some AADTs, the average daily traffic, and any other flow or data that is available locally also can go into that fitness function, that comparison. And then based on that comparison, it's fed into an evolutionary algorithm, which is a branch of machine learning, to, in an iterative process, determine the travel origin destination demand. So going through this process, we have at the outcome, at the conclusion of this iterative process, we will have a traffic supply model for the entire network, and we will have a travel origin destination demand. And these two things will be in equilibrium and matching as best as possible the observed data, which is a usable model. It's a supply model, a demand estimation. They will be in equilibrium. They will be matching the observation. So demand model, supply model, in equilibrium, matching observation. That is the base model we then use for this criticality and this planning hypothetical. Fortunately, long before sort of the current massive take-up of these types of machine learning techniques, we have about 20 years of focused research on transportation problems using evolutionary algorithms to solve them. And so that was a fortunate benefit long term of having a strong familiarity with these emerging techniques. And that's been quite useful in this work. I'll just talk about two specific cases quickly. As Elko mentioned, we've been looking through Pakistan, Tajikistan, Papua New Guinea. Did some earlier work, Armenia, South Caucasus, and elsewhere. But here, just very quickly on Tajikistan and Papua New Guinea. So this is the Tajikistan National Road Network model established by the process I just described. A reasonably sized model, over 7,000 links, 20,000 kilometers of roadway, 70 travel zones were determined. And that's primarily based on network characteristics in the world population data in terms of the zonal structure. But you can adjust this zonal structure if there's more disaggregation desired. That's easily run, but this proved to be a reasonable base for analysis. And in terms of comparing with the local data, it stacked up in this instance extremely well based on all available road count data. I will go for timing. I won't go through extremely fine points, but rather to demonstrate from the case studies the response that we need to see from these type of models. So as just one highlighted case, we looked at potential road closure from Dangara to Gulistan. And this is a very significant roadway in Tajikistan. The current typical travel time, if you look at Google, is about an hour. This was stacked up in terms of local experience interacting with the road authority there. From the modeling from the National Road Model, it was modeled at 71 minutes, which was deemed well within the typical potential experience. Some variability, obviously, day to day. But if this facility were to close, what would be the effect throughout the entire network? And that's what then the model can be used to evaluate because we have those origin destination demands. It's equilibrium based. We can simply close the facility, or it could also be reduced in capacity, whichever. The model can be re-equilibrated, and all of the traffic throughout the entire network then will shift. And you'll see the impact here. The blue is the current base case, and quite significant flow down through that roadway. And if it were to close, well, that traffic then switches elsewhere. Much of it goes immediately eastward through observation, but there's a significant impact across the entire network. In terms of the system-wide vehicle kilometers traveled, you'll see a 3% change, but even greater if you're looking at travel time, 8.9% increase across the entire system, which is quite significant because if you get far away from that impact, that gets averaged in as well. And so at a systems level, that is quite significant, but massive in terms of that point-to-point travel time, going from a 71 up to a 252-minute from that point-to-point difference in travel time, a massive impact of that potential closure. And so this is the system level, and this is the sort of thing that becomes very critical when looking at the network criticality and that system level impact of potential facility alterations. For Papua New Guinea, here's the model for that. Because of the nature of Papua New Guinea and focusing on the main island, we modeled a northern network and a southern. The northern, both around the just under 2,000 links, or 1,500 for the south network. Still significant roadways, 12,000 kilometers of roadways in the north network, for instance. And again, comparing to local data, we did have some AADT counts for Papua New Guinea, but then also the travel times from the data providers. We did do one interesting hypothetical. We were asked, looking at what if that network were to connect in some demand scenarios. And so using some economic assumptions around potential demand scenarios, we could evaluate some system level flows from potential connections, and that was quite interesting. But that's probably a broader use of this type of modeling. But probably of most importance here today is doing directly a criticality analysis on that Papua New Guinea network, potential roadway impacts. So we did those separately for the northern and the southern. Here we have the northern, which is a bit richer of a network. And we put these into two cases because of the relatively sparse nature of the network. There are many cases where if there is an impact on a roadway and it is not traversable, then the network as a whole becomes disconnected. And that's a rather massive impact. And so we separated the criticality by those situations where there was a complete network disconnection, and then along particular corridors, how many links caused a disconnection. And so we have one analysis around those, and we highlighted Katubu Road in particular. Every link along that was highly critical and would cause a disconnection. And then we had a separate analysis for the non-disconnecting roadways, where if they did have a failure, it would not disconnect the network, but there may still be a significant impact because of the traffic response. The traffic is able to take an alternative route, but it may do so at a much worse performance for the system and the population. And Highlands Highway, for instance, did not disconnect the network, but causes a rather significant 104, almost 105% increase in total system travel time. And then others were a bit less, and some roadways, there were sufficient alternatives where if there was a problem, the alternatives that exist were more than able to handle the rerouted traffic. And so by having this equilibrium-based sort of traffic assignment model response, we're able to evaluate these things and the traffic rerouting. And actually, I try to go as short and sweet. So in the talk today, particularly from Elko, presented a resilience workflow that, based on the types of data used, can be applied globally. Now, having said that, as Elko made the point very well, every bit of extra local information will reduce the uncertainty in the results. All models are based on assumptions and based on data, and the better data that can be incorporated, the better the modeling results. Nonetheless, there are an increasing number of global data sets that allow for a first scoping analysis globally. We've integrated and combined this multi-hazard analysis with traffic equilibrium modeling to be able to handle this full workflow. The plan from here, there will be final reports based on all of these analysis in terms of ADB publication is our working aim. And we're also working towards academic publications, because for much of this overall workflow and many of the methods used for different aspects are quite novel, even scientifically, as new tools available to both the practicing and research community. And I think with that, we're happy for any questions.
Thank you both for the comprehensive look at the workflow for multi-hazard resilience. It is fascinating to see how the inclusion of criticality changes the risk equation from a simple asset check to a systemic analysis of service disruption. We have several questions coming in from the audience, but I'd like to start with a few of my own. So first, on the data integration and uncertainty, the framework utilizes a multi-hazard database, including flood data and landslide from different sources. Given that every bit of extra local information reduces uncertainty, what advice do we have for in data poor environments who want to start using this workflow? What is the minimum viable data needed to make this a useful analysis?
I think the minimum viable data available is what we've showed already the global data that is out there is for sure good enough for this first scoping analysis. So I think that's basically out there, and yeah, we've done this in many places around the world now. So I think that all works. It's more that for next, if you then really want to decide, in particular, if you want to move towards loans and deciding on how high your loan should be, or investment should be, then someone really need to hop on the plane and go there and really need to enhance the information. But really, this first hotspot identification, there we, I think, have the data there. I did respond to, I think it was Joseph, on coastal flooding. So in some cases, hazard data is not really there yet. So for coastal flooding, we do notice that global coastal flood data, at least in the public domain, is not there. I know that FATM and JBA, for example, are working on that. So it is coming. So there are still some gaps, but I think a starting point is always there.
Maybe
Okay,
from my side, beyond the hazard, probably because we can do a traffic model based only on the globally available travel time data in World POP and other forms of data. But at the very least, what helps on the traffic side is the some set of AADT traffic counts. Virtually everywhere tends to maintain those somewhere within one authority or the other. We've never had a case where we've not been able to get some of them, but I would say that really just helps validate the traffic model, even though technically we can build it without them, but that just helps that validation.
Okay, thank you. I noticed that Elko answered some of the questions. Maybe for the benefit of the wider audience, we will just choose one question. So from Mr. Nigam, his question is, for a road network, shall we apply climate adaptation measures on part of the network that serves the connectivity to key facilities and serve as escape route for affected community and keep the rest of the road network as traditional?
Yeah, so I think how I responded already. I think Michael, you're unmuted. So I mean, of course, in an ideal world where you have unlimited funds, not just unlimited funds, but also unlimited material and construction workers, personnel, you of course want to tackle everything, but that is not possible. Also here in the Netherlands, we struggle, or in Europe, we also have a severe lack of material and personnel, and even a bit of money as well. But anyways, so even if you want to tackle everything, it's simply not possible. So we really just hope through all these studies that we can just better identify what to focus on first. And what we here really want to show that, in particularly for infrastructure systems, which is even more so perhaps than a regular building, or like roads have a clear function in a country, in the system. Like, I mean, they provide a clear societal service. So to prioritize, we really want to emphasize how this societal service complements along your more traditional asset or link focus in an analysis, to then help to even better focus on those roads that are not just vulnerable to climate hazards, but are also essential for your system. So you just want to focus on those first. So that's, I think, the key of this study, where we really want to add this criticality element to your more traditional asset vulnerability approach that we use so widely already.
You're muted, Gloria.
So sorry. There's one final question. So in modeling, we're looking at here in New Zealand, how do you define the link? we have been using the term link and have defined it as the availability of a unique detour or no detour and unique OD pairing. On this basis, we use links for monetizing the impacts so that we can consider financial and economic on a fairer basis. So basically, can you please clarify how you define the link, Travis?
Yeah, we for us it relates to roadway. So we begin with OpenStreetMaps, and depending on the context, it may be a national network, or it may go down to secondary, primary, secondary, or even lower level roadways, depending on the density and the planning questions that are being considered. But it's really a roadway based link definition, uh, which for us is useful in terms of the traffic assignment and routing and traffic property. So it's really a roadway physical based definition for our analysis.
Okay, there's another question here. Last one. Professor Travis, thank you for your excellent presentation. I have a question. How do you think the rapid evolution of AI technologies will bring opportunities or new approaches in transport network modeling? For instance, do you see potential for using AI agents to collect or generate the data required for such models, including
Yeah,
supply and demand data?
Mm-mm. Yes, this is a highly active area of research with many other colleagues. Because I'm not very. I've worked with those who do survey design and econometrics very frequently in my career, but my core area is network modeling. But across all of these, even for the network modeling, definitely the survey methods. Yeah, agentic AI, all of these things are very powerful tools, and they're emerging and changing and evolving very rapidly. And they will definitely change the way we all do the research and practice of this field. I think that's being felt across all domains. I speak with my colleagues in health and medicine. I gave an invited talk last year at Johns Hopkins, and they're having a campus-wide debate about how it's changing everything, and many universities are, and research institutions and authorities globally. Um, but how that change will look, and from the communities I interact with, the primary issue is how to appropriately blend these emerging techniques, because it's likely, the way they had put it when I was at Johns Hopkins, for every domain, the core question is, what should we not give up? So whether it's health, medicine, or transportation, regardless of your domain, what are the core principles that are important that make that domain different? Power markets and power systems are different than human mobility systems, for instance. But why? What really is that central principle, first order principle, that we have to adhere to so that our planning is coherent and reliable and useful for these high level strategic investments? And that's what we have to continually focus on, is my assertion. Is what are those principles blended with these emerging techniques? But will they change things? Absolutely. Is there incredible opportunity and promise in making things more efficient, more accessible? Yes, without question. But we have to also be a bit cautious in how we blend these emerging techniques with our core professional principles.
Okay, thank you very much. We will answer some of your questions offline, but at first, we thank you, Dr. Cox and Professor Waller, for your insights, and thank you to our audience for joining us. Before we end today's webinar, with your permission, I'd like to share a few announcements. Please don't forget to fill out our webinar evaluation form. Someone will flash the QR code to help us improve future webinars. You do so by scanning the QR code. If you are getting value from our webinar series, we invite you to join the Green Roads community to receive updates on the Green Roads Toolkit and related news, and webinars via the on-screen QR code or the link in the chat box. You can also access the recording and presentation from this session as well from past Green Roads webinar series sessions on the ADB Knowledge Events page, available via the on-screen QR code or the link in the chat box. And finally, you can access ADB Green Roads Toolkit, a compendium of best practices that can help governments, transport professionals build low carbon and inclusive road infrastructure via the on-screen QR code or the link in the chat box. Thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Bye.
Thank you all.